Thank
So,
you.
Maharaj, Revered Atmeshananda Maharaj, welcome to our
Namaste.
webinar. Yeah, it's nice to see you. And this is the second session now. We are now shifting to another area. I mean, further down south. We finished Southeast Asia, and now we are going to the Australian subcontinent, the Australian continent, and the other areas nearby. So we have a senior monk of our order who has been in Australia for a very long time now. And if you remember, Swamiji once said regarding the non-sectarian, there were some questions which were asked about Hinduism and other things. Once in 1897 at Lahore, Swamiji told a Hindu fundamentalist, of course, there was a lot of pressure on Swamiji, but still he said something very remarkable in Lahore, which is now part of Pakistan. He said, I have the power to bring 1/3 of the population of the world under the banner of Sri Ramakrishna, but I have no intention of doing so. That would counteract my Guru's great message of harmony. As many faiths, so many paths. And a new sect would originate in India. So we have to remember this thing, that Ramakrishna Mission, though it is named after Sri Ramakrishna, it's a non-sectarian movement which believes in the harmony of religions, a universal approach to religion, universal and scientific approach to religion. So now we shall briefly, I will give you, I'll introduce Swami Atmeshananda, who is the monk in charge of Brisbane chapter of Vedanta Centre of Sydney. So Australia has many centers, many chapters, you can say. Brisbane, we have in Adelaide, we have in other parts of Australia. He'll be speaking about that. And the topic that he will be touching upon is Ramakrishna Movement in Australia, New Zealand and Fiji, where we have a presence for many years now. New Zealand, of course, we have started a center recently. So, Revered Swami Atmeshananda Maharaj is a monk in charge of the Brisbane chapter, as I said, of the Vedanta Centre of Sydney, Australia, which is headed by Revered Swami Sridharanji Maharaj. And he joined, Swami Atmeshananda joined the Ramakrishna Order in 1978 and served at the headquarters, Belur Mutt, then Rajkot, Mumbai, Bangalore, and then Singapore centers before coming to Sydney. So he has served in the Singapore center as well. So in 2001, he came to Sydney. That's long ago, nearly 21 years ago, where he served till 2013. Since 2013, from Sydney, he shifted to Brisbane and built a beautiful temple there. There's a nice center in Brisbane. They are all big enough to be independent centers. So he's serving the Brisbane center and looking after the center as its monk in charge. So now I would, without taking any further time, I would request, we are very happy that Revered Swami Atmeshananda Maharaj is with us. So we would like him to highlight the Ramakrishna movement, the bird's eye view of the Ramakrishna movement in Australia, New Zealand and Fiji, the challenges they had to face and the future prospects. About that, we would like you to enlighten us.
Thank you, Swami Sarvasthanandaji, and my regards to everyone here. I would just begin with a prayer. Om Jananeem Sharadam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayosritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. I am reminded of Swami Vivekananda's great saying when I think of the work that is being done in our centers, more so in centers outside of India. Swami Vivekananda said, and I quote, "Slow and silent, like the gentle dew that falls in the morning, unseen and unheard, yet producing a most tremendous result, has been the work of the calm, patient, all-suffering spiritual race upon the world of thought. The propagation of a tradition, it's called in Sanskrit as parampara, a very loaded word. This propagation has three aspects. The first aspect involves the spiritual practices of the person who begins the tradition, who starts the tradition, and the results that he or she obtains through such practices. In our case, the sadhanas of Sri Ramakrishna and his achievements is the main basis of the tradition. But there is something very special in Sri Ramakrishna tradition. Sri Ramakrishna indeed practiced his spiritual practices and achieved his siddhi. But one thing which he did was he transmitted or he vested all of his powers in Holy Mother. Devotees of Sri Ramakrishna would remember how on the day of the Phalaharini Kali Puja, Sri Ramakrishna offered his everything to the Holy Mother, making her sit on the asana or on the pedestal of the Divine Mother. He offered his everything, including his Rudrakshamala or beads. Thus, he started an organization wherein both the spiritual power and the means by which one can transmit that power has been established. The second aspect of a parampara or a tradition is that the chief propagator or the prophet who begins the tradition instructs his or her close disciples or associates and sets in motion a machinery to put into effect the tradition. The direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, like Swami Vivekananda and others, they reflect this. We also have to remember an incident in the life of Holy Mother Sharda Devi. She was sitting on the balcony of Nilambar Mukherjee's garden house, which is next to Velur Math today. And she had this vision of Sri Ramakrishna rising from the Ganges, the Ganga, and then Swami Vivekananda and several other devotees. Swami Vivekananda got into the waters of the Ganga, and then he started dispersing the waters of the Ganga, saying Jai Ramakrishna, and then he started dispersing this water. This is what it is, dispersing the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. And behind them was Holy Mother Sharda Devi, who was the guiding principle. The third stage or the third aspect of a tradition is the systematic propagation of the movement by the disciples or followers of the tradition. I somehow tend to think that the direct disciples had a great role to play in the propagation of this Ramakrishna movement in the West. Swami Shivananda, one of the direct disciples, went to Sri Lanka, now Sri Lanka, at that time Ceylon, in 1897 at the behest of Swami Vivekananda. There, he started holding classes on the scriptures, especially the Bhagavad Gita and the other scriptures. And slowly, a few Europeans started coming to attend to his talks. At that time, the Sri Lanka had a large number of people from England and other places, Europe, other parts of Europe. They lived there. And there he chose one particular lady whose name was Mrs. Elsie Pickett. She was an Australian lady from Adelaide, the south of Australia. And she was touring Ceylon, or she was staying in Ceylon for some time. She was deeply attracted to Swami Shivanandaji. And Swami Shivanandaji most probably initiated her and gave her the name Sister Haripriya. And Swami Shivanandaji told her, you go back to Australia and propagate these teachings that you have learned from here. I would believe that Swami Shivananda transmitted his spiritual power to this lady, who became one of the earliest Vedantins here in Australia. She came back and she used to hold classes on scriptural topics in Australia as well as in New Zealand. And thus, a very small number of people got attracted towards the teachings of Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Vedanta. Another lady, Miss Mary Elizabeth Stevenson, she got very much attracted to Vedanta when she heard Swami Vivekananda in 1900 in San Francisco. She wrote of her own experience of hearing Swami Vivekananda. She says, no matter how long the Swami spoke, he was fresh after even 2 hours of continuous speaking, as he was at the commencement of his lecture. When Swami Vivekananda returned to India, Swami Abhedananda took his place in New York, and she started corresponding with him, and slowly she became his disciple, and she was named as Sister Avabamiya. Swami Sridharanandaji, our senior monk here, he feels that probably the name was misspelled and it must have been Sister Abhavaniya, that is the unthinkable. That must be the correct pronunciation of or spelling of her name. Be as it may. She was told by Swami Abhedanandaji to go and propagate the Vedanta in Australia and New Zealand. So she came to Australia in about 1908, and she came to Australia in 1908, and she was a gifted speaker. She was a much sought after speaker. She initially lived in Sydney, and later she lived in Melbourne. And while in Sydney, she started a monthly journal and called it the Star of the East. Later, she renamed it as the Vedanta Universal Messenger. After staying in Australia for a few years, 3 or 4 years, Sister Abhavaniya went to Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Already a large number of people were influenced by Swami Vivekananda's teachings over there. And she started 2 schools over there to educate children. Later, she transferred, or the schools were taken over by the Ramakrishna Mission. Apparently, she did not return to Australia. After that, she went back to the United States, most probably. Another lady who was instrumental in bringing Vedanta to Australia and New Zealand was Bland Edith Bourne. She was a poet, and she was born in 1870 in Putney, London. She visited New Zealand in 1900 and was charmed by the beauty of the country. And she settled down at a place called Charlton, a tiny isolated community on the Banks Peninsula. And then around 1902, she had a mystic experience, and she writes about it. I was swept up out of myself altogether and into a flood of white glory. She did not understand what is that experience. So she started searching some literature, and then she traveled to San Francisco in 1915, and there met Swami Prakashananda. She lived at the San Francisco Center for about a year and returned again to New Zealand. And in about 1920, Bourne experienced one increasing purpose, that's what she called, one increasing purpose in life, namely a more humane and effective treatment of prisoners and society's misfits. So she struggled. She wrote long articles, wrote a lot of poems, and inspired people not to look down upon these prisoners and society's misfits, but treat them in a more human way. In about 1930, she started an ashram. That's what she called it, an ashram in Akarua, South Island of New Zealand, which is in Banks Peninsula area. And there she lived a wonderful life. She had a few companions, or she had a few disciples, and they all led a wonderful life of purity and dedication to serving the poor and the unfortunate people. And she apparently died in Akarua on August 20th of 1958. So thus, this movement of Vedanta movement has started very early. I can say in 1897 itself, when Sister Haripriya went to Sri Lanka, and she was inspired by Swami Shivanandaji. Therefore, it is probable that later Swami Shivanandaji guided Swami Ranganathanandaji to establish the Vedanta centers in Australia. It is due to Swami Ranganathanandaji's concerted efforts that the centers have taken place or have come up in Australia. Now I will go to another part of this world, that is Fiji. Fiji was a British colony, and Indians were brought by the ship to work in the cane farm, sugar cane farms. The CSR company, that is the sugar company, they would bring them and they would make them work without giving them any much of facilities. Stories have been told about the atrocities that the owners of the sugar mills used to, atrocities that they would commit on these poor people. So Gandhiji, Mahatma Gandhi, sent his confidant and friend C.F. Andrews in about 1914 or 1915 to Fiji. He said, you go and see what is happening over there. We hear that the Indians who have been taken over there are not treated well at all. So C.F. Andrews went and stayed there in Fiji for some time, studied the conditions of the people, came and reported it to Mahatma Gandhi. I do not know whether it is because of Mahatma Gandhi or due to some other reasons. Swami Atmeshananda was sent to Fiji in the year 1937. Atmeshananda knew Tamil, and so he could converse with the people over there, and slowly he started inspiring them to have education. Education was non-existent among the migrants over there in those days. They were treated as slaves. So Swami Atmeshananda inspired them, but he could not stay there for too long. He returned to India in 1938, and he noticed a young Swami, Swami Rudrananda, who had of his own volition started working in the untouchable quarters of Chennai. He would go there and he would give them education, he would give them clothing and food, etc. He would beg and then he would do that. So he then requested Swami Rudrananda to go to Fiji and stand by these Indian laborers. So in 1939, this Swami Rudrananda went to Fiji, and on his way, he stayed in Sydney for a few days. And from there, he went to Fiji. Once he went to Fiji, he started working among the cane farmers, sugar cane farmers. And he worked tirelessly for their benefit, for their upliftment. So much so that he started a Hindi weekly called Jagriti, published by Sharada Sangam Press. And he slowly founded a private school called the Sri Vivekananda School, high school in Nandi, in Fiji. But his involvement with the struggle of the cane farmers continued. So much so that the colonial government had put a house arrest order restricting Swami Rudranandaji and another barrister, that is A.D. Patel, they restricted their movement within 5-mile radius of the Nandi town. Rudranandaji thus laid a great foundation for the education of the poor Indian cane farmers in Fiji. And he worked tirelessly towards them. In fact, many of the government officials used to criticize him for being a monk and yet getting involved with the politics of the cane farmers. He also went to England to plead for the case of the cane farmers, and he came back victoriously with the assurance of the government that they would have some minimum wages for the cane farmers and that they would establish education institutions for them. Swami Rudranandaji was a reformer, and he was very passionate about education. There was no higher education in Fiji at that time. So the students had to either go to India or they had to go to Australia or New Zealand for their higher education. So in the 1950s, Swami Rudrananda bought a 1,000-acre property in a township called Tai Levu. It's about 1,000 feet altitude. And there he wanted to establish an institute of higher education, eventually a university over there. But there was tremendous opposition from the government as well as some vested interests. So he could not start it. Only very recently that 1,000-acre land was given away to the farmers, I understand. Swami Rudrananda lived there in Fiji, and he passed away in 1981. And then Swami Damodaranandaji, who went to Fiji in 1976 from Singapore, he took over, and under his leadership, the work in Australia and New Zealand began to progress. Rudranandaji confined himself mainly to Fiji, whereas Swami Damodaranandaji used to travel outside and he used to inspire people. Now coming to Australia, in about 1924 or 25, a young man called James Wales, he had returned from Egypt and the Middle East, where he was involved in the First World War. James Wales came back, and because of the trials and tribulations that he went through and seeing the sufferings during the World War, James Wales was terribly disappointed and depressed. So he became addicted to alcohol and to cigarettes. So when he came back to Australia and lived with his sister in Sydney at that time, he was totally given to alcoholism. According to the story that we hear here. One day, it must have been his birthday, he was sent by his sister to go and bring some groceries, etc. Actually, he wanted to go and have a drink with his friend. So as he was trying to cross the street, suddenly he heard a voice or a name, Swami Vivekananda. That name struck a note in his soul. Something transpired within him, and he then and there vowed not to touch any alcohol from then onwards. He went to his friend and he told him of his conviction that he does not want to be an alcoholic anymore. And his friend jocularly remarked, "So, are you also going to give up your cigarettes?" He said, "Yes, I am going to give up." And that moment he gave up all of his vices. And then he wanted to know what this voice is, where is this name? He had never heard that name. And so he went about searching in the bookstalls. There was an old second-hand bookstore in Sydney, in a place called The Rocks. And there he found a second-hand copy of the Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda. He took the book, read it from page to page, and then he was convinced that this is the life that he wants to lead. And he wrote to Advaita Ashram, Mayavati at that time. So he wrote to the president of Advaita Ashram and said, "I want to lead this life that Swami Vivekananda speaks about, the life of a yogi." The letter was sent to the headquarters of the Ramakrishna Mission, and he was sent a response that said, "Yes, if you are so much interested, you can come." So probably in 1925, James Wales went to Belur Math. He lived there and he became a disciple of Swami Shivanandaji, and Swami Shivanandaji gave him Brahmacharya initiation, and he was known as Brahmachari Viveka Chaitanya. We have heard from Swami Bhuteshanandaji that he knew this Viveka Chaitanya. He had seen him during the first convention that was held at Belur Math in 1926. In 1928, James Wales' health did not permit him to stay in India anymore. So Swami Shivanandaji gave him his blessings and said, "Go and lead the life of a monk and serve the people in your country." So he returned to Sydney in Australia, and he used to read the works of Swamiji, the life of Sri Ramakrishna. At that time, the life of Holy Mother was not yet published. And he used to inspire people by his conduct. Some people used to call him the holy man. And he used to serve people. If he knew that somebody is very sick, especially the elderly, he would go and cook for them and then take them to the doctors and look after them with great kindness. In about 1971 or so, Swami Ranganathanandaji, when he visited, he went and personally met some of those people who knew James Wales. And they all said, especially three of them, they said that this person was a wonderful soul. He looked after our parents. He would come every day and he would feed them. He would cook, clean, and he would look after them. So the Shivagane Jiva Seva, look upon all beings as manifestations of the divine. This message had entered into deeply into the hearts of James Wales, and he passed away in 1952. Not much is known about him more than this. In 1958, Swami Ranganathanandaji first visited Australia. He was on a tour of Singapore, Japan, and Fiji. So on the way, he had to stop in Sydney, and he met one of the interested Vedanta devotees in those days, and he just left a little bit of interest in their hearts. But it was not until 1968 when Swami Ranganathanandaji was sent as the cultural ambassador of India that he started giving talks. So in 1968, he first came to Australia, and he was hosted by the Indian High Commission, and lectures were arranged for him. In the meantime, probably in the 1951 or 52, another lady called Wilma Spencer was going through a lot of mental hardships. She was searching for an answer to her queries, and she found it in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda literature. So she went to India in probably 1954 or 55, and she met Swami Yatishwaranandaji, who initiated her and told her to go back to Australia and conduct activities or propagate the words or the thoughts of Ramakrishna Vivekananda and Vedanta. So she came back, and she used to import books, and it was very interesting. She would keep the books in the boot of her car, which was a station wagon. She would go to all those places where there would be a lot of crowd, like circuses in those days. There was no television. So there were circuses and then fairs and all that. She would go there, park her car behind, and would spread out the books. And she would sell those books. That's how the Ramakrishna Vivekananda literature started propagating here in Australia. Wilma Spencer was one of the great instruments of Sri Ramakrishna to propagate the Ramakrishna Vedanta movement in Australia. So Wilma Spencer's son, Rick Spencer, is still here in Australia, and he's a very silent and dedicated devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Ranganathanandaji started visiting Australia from 1971 onwards up to 1982. Every year, without fail, he would visit Australia. First, he would go to Perth. In Perth, there was a devotee, Dr. Amrutalingam Sinnathambi, whose father, Mr. Sinnathambi, was a disciple of Swami Virajanandaji Maharaj, the president of the order at that time. So Dr. Amrutalingam Sinnathambi used to host the Swami, and he would organize lectures. Later, it was taken over by his younger brother, Mahalingam Sinnathambi, who is now in Brisbane. So thus, Swami Ranganathanandaji would conduct lectures in Perth, in Sydney, and there was another interested devotee here in Sydney, whose name was Ivan Malik, and her husband, Peter Malik. They had established a small ashram called the Ganesha Ashram in the Blue Mountains area of near Sydney. And he used to organize, or they used to organize retreats whenever Swami Ranganathananji would come to Australia. Thus, a small group of interested devotees formed around Swami Ranganathanandaji, and they were very keen on having a Ramakrishna, a center of the Ramakrishna order in Australia. But it was not so easy. Australia had a white Australian policy. That is, only white people would be allowed to come and settle in Australia until the 1974. This white Australian policy was in place. As a result, there was a great resistance in the minds of the general white Australians against people of other colors. One of our devotees, Mr. Russell Atkinson, he says that it was very difficult. In 1951 or 52, he had invited some Indian yogi to come to his house. He and his wife hosted him into their house. As a result of hosting, they were evicted from the house. Just imagine the kind of bias that was there. They were evicted from the house. That was the status of the people of other colors in Australia. So it was an uphill task indeed. But Swami Ranganathanandaji was requested by the devotees to send some monks. At that time, Ramakrishna Mission was not prepared to send any monks. It was not ready. So Ranganathanandaji requested the Sharada Mutt to send a nun whom he knew. So Ajaya Prana, Pravrajika Ajaya Prana, who was then in Trivandrum in Kerala, she was sent, and she came first probably in 1978, and later she came and established this center, and from 1982 onwards, she used to conduct classes, and a group of sincere devotees gathered around her. In 1984, she established the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society, Ramakrishna Sharada Vedanta Society of New South Wales. And so Sharada Mutt was the first center of the Ramakrishna order in Australia. And that ashram still is there. There are 3 nuns as of today. One of the nuns, Pravrajika Gayatri Prana, came along with Pravrajika Ajaya Prana, and she has remained here. Ajaya Prana has since passed away. In the late 90s, Swami Gahananandaji and Swami Bhuteshanandaji, Gahananandaji, and later Swami Smarananandaji visited Australia. And in 1993, Swami Sridharanandaji also came to Australia for the first time, being invited by Swami Damodaranandaji, who took him to Fiji and then to New Zealand and Australia. And they started giving talks. So there was a desire in the hearts of some of the devotees to have a branch of the Ramakrishna Mission over in Australia. So therefore, Swami Smarananandaji visited in 1999. Smarananandaji, the present president of the order, visited Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, and then he decided, he was the general secretary at that time, he then decided that a center, the time is ripe for a center to be established in Australia. And so in October 2000, Swami Sridharanandaji, who was then the head of the Ramakrishna Mission in Lucknow, who was there for nearly 44 years or so. So he was uprooted from there and he was asked to proceed to Australia. So on the way, he passed through Singapore, and I was there at that time, and he requested me whether I could come and assist him in Australia. So he came and he stayed with a wonderful couple, Mr. B. Ramakrishna and Mrs. Kanaka Ramakrishna. Mrs. Kanaka Ramakrishna was from Mysore. She was a disciple of Swami Atmeshananda, and she helped in editing the books in Kannada language while she was in Mysore. She was very close to Swami Somanathanandaji of Ramakrishna Ashram, Mysore. So when she and her husband, B. Ramakrishna, came to Australia, they were very keen to have a center of the Ramakrishna Mission and Ramakrishna Mutt over here. So they appealed to Swami Smarananandaji. And so when Swami Sridharanandaji came in October 2000, he stayed with them for a few days, and then he rented a house in a place called Strathfield in Sydney. And after a few months, he shifted to another rented house. And I arrived in Australia in March 2001. And from then onwards, we started the work over here. Even before that, he used to give classes. And he's now about 97, and he still gives classes, and he has extraordinary tenacity and intellectual prowess. So the first ashram was a rented house. Now something happened. It was a rented house. Sometimes people would come, especially Indians would come for prayers and all that. But we were keeping it very silent and without much noise. Unfortunately, a neighbor went and complained to the local council, Strathfield Council, and said, here we have got some ochre-robed people, and we are afraid that they are Hare Krishnas and that they will be chanting and be dancing everywhere. So we don't want them here. So he went and complained. We were summoned by the mayor of the council. We went and told the council, the CEO of the council as well as the mayor, that no, we are not from the dancing company, but that we are genuine monks, that we are into meditation and prayer and holding classes. In fact, we were holding classes in a public place, in a bowling club hall. We used to hold it there. So anyway, we thought that it is now time for us to move to a larger place and which we would own. And so we moved to another house in another part of Sydney. And later, now we are situated in another area called Ermington, where we have a center. And when we began, we also thought that it is not enough just to preach and teach, and that we should also do some work for the people. So we started organizing classes for the people who are weak in, especially for the migrants, and also some tuition classes for children. So, and also we were doing some counseling services, etc. So that is about Sydney, and now it is a very growing institution. After Sydney, Swami Sridharanandaji, when he came, he wanted that every capital of every state in Australia must have a center, Vedanta Centre. There were already groups of devotees in in Brisbane, that is in Queensland, in Adelaide, that is in South Australia, in Perth, that is in Western Australia, as well as in Melbourne, that is in the state of Victoria. So Swami Sridharanandji would travel every weekend to these centers. Every weekend, he would be in one or the other of these centers. From Thursday till Saturday, the Swami would be giving talks in either Sydney, either Melbourne or Perth or in Adelaide. But traveling to Queensland, that is Brisbane, also was becoming too much for him. So I started coming to Brisbane from 2002 onwards. I started coming to Brisbane. And in 2013, I ultimately moved to Brisbane. And here we have been donated in Queensland. We have been donated with about 51 acres of land, wherein we have a center. Here we run the classes and all of that. Plus we have a soup kitchen where we serve meals to the needy. While Australia is a developed country, there are pockets wherein there are people who are still needy. So we serve about, on an average, about 100 meals every week to the needy people free of charge. We also serve them groceries, etc. every week. And on Saturdays, also we run a cafe with very nominal price. We run a small cafe also over here. And we have some other activities ongoing. Plans are afoot to start an Institute of Culture and Civilization over here in the future. And when we arrived in Australia, a lot of devotees, elderly devotees, would come to us and would say, Swamiji, we came here to this country to help our children, to look after our grandchildren especially. Now our grandchildren have all grown up and we don't have anything to do. Now we want to stay somewhere wherein we are free from all our attachments. So that many times they would come and approach. Now that we have this land here in Queensland, in Brisbane, we are aiming at having some retirement accommodations over here where people could come and live a life of prayer, meditation, and also serve the people and serve the community over here. We are doing all the plans as of now to start this kind of a retirement village. It will be a Vedanta village over here. And a center has also been started. A center was started in 2004 in Melbourne. Devotees, some of the devotees in Melbourne wanted to have a center. And one of our Swamis, Swami Sunishtananda, is presently there. Devotees in Adelaide also wanted a center. So a center has been started in Adelaide, and Swami Manyananda is looking after the activities over there. A church was bought in Adelaide, of course, a couple of years ago, and that is where the activities are being conducted. In 2009, another church was bought in Perth, which is called as Vedanta Church of Universal Religion. And so we have a shrine for Sri Ramakrishna, and we conduct all activities over there. So the Ramakrishna movement in Australia has spread very slowly. There's no doubt. Probably it is one of the last continents where Ramakrishna reached late. But the seeds of this movement were sown by the direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, both Swami Shivanandaji in 1897 by initiating Sister Haripriya L.C. Pickett, and then by Swami Abhedanandaji, who initiated Sister Avabhamya or Abhavaniya in 1904 or so, 1908. So she came to Australia and she started this movement over here. Sri Ramakrishna once heard this narration of a vision by a devotee, which is mentioned a few years ago. Swami Prabhanandaji, one of the vice president of our order, visited Brisbane, and in one of his talks, he narrated this. And he said that this devotee had a vision. And he said that a Brahmin of divine personage was walking on the river or walking on the ocean. And then this devotee who was standing on the shore said, "How is it that you are walking? Please wait. I would also come and join you." So that Brahmin said, "Well, I cannot wait now. I need to go. You come later. There is a bridge underneath, which you cannot see, but there is a bridge underneath. And you can take the bridge and use the bridge and then come." So this, when he mentioned this vision to Sri Ramakrishna immediately said, "Wow, that is a great vision. You must get your mantra, you must get your spiritual initiation now." So I feel that Sri Ramakrishna is there. He is the bridge. We only need to step upon the bridge, give up our concerns, step upon the bridge, and this bridge will take us to our destination. Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda used to say that this body, this organization, this order is the body of Sri Ramakrishna himself. So we take upon ourselves, we must take upon ourselves this responsibility of holding on to to the ideals of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swami Vivekananda, and traverse through our journey, life's journey. So may their grace and blessings always protect us. This order, according to Swami Vivekananda, will be there for several hundred years. And one version says 700 to 800 years. Another version says 1500 years. Whatever it be, it's only the beginning. The organization is only in its beginning stages, 125 years. It's not much. So His grace, may His grace protect us all, is my humble prayer. Thank you.
We are grateful to you, Maharaj, for this wonderful account, not only the statistics and the external development,